Hi, I'm Wayne Kett, and I work for Norfolk Museum Service in the collections management team. So I have quite a varied job really, um, but a large part of the work I do involves managing our stored collections, um, and part of that has been looking after our program of rationalisation over the past 8 years. In that period of time, we have approved for disposal and rehomed a total of 670 individual objects. And I've also delivered lots of training sessions on review and rationalisation of collections for Share Museums East over that time. So what I'm going to share with you today are my top 10 tips for rationalising museum collections. But before I get cracking with my top 10 tips, I just wanted to explain the backdrop behind me. So what you're looking at is an image of the Norfolk Collection Centre, which is Norfolk Museum Service's publicly accessible store. It's very much a working store. However, we run, in the pre-COVID days anyway, we run public events here and do tours and provide access to our collections to the general public. And it's kind of a good example of how museum stores could be. We're by no means there at Norfolk Museum Service yet. We've got plenty of work to do in our other stores, but this is a good example of how our museum stores could be. And I've spoken to colleagues from museums up and down the country, whether they're from big national museums or local authorities or universities or small and large independents and national trust. Whoever I've spoken to has told me the same thing, that their stores are filled to bursting point and that they have no room for new acquisitions, or at least it's really, really tricky to bring new things into the collection, and it's difficult to care for the collections they have in the store. I mean, to get to the wonderful Norfolk Collection Centre publicly accessible store that we have, involved a funded project, but central to it and key to it was our program of rationalisation in order to create the space we needed to be able to have a publicly accessible space for our collections. And that is at the heart of it for me, the problem. Unless any of you have got large pots of money to build brand new stores, the only way you're going to get to a store like this is by reducing the overall size of your collection. And that's why rationalisation is so important, because that's how we can do it in a careful, methodical, ethical and legal way. And it's such an important issue. That's why I'm so pleased that Share have chosen it as the topic for this year's Collections Care Conference. So I will crack on with my top 10 tips. They are by no means comprehensive. It's not a complete guide as to how to dispose of your collections. It's just some insights I have picked up over the years, and I hope that they are useful for you. Okay, so number one, and these aren't in order of importance. This is, however, the most important of the 10. Start with your acquisitions. Start by looking at what's coming in the front door, okay? Because in museums it's an awful lot easier to acquire new things than it is to dispose of them, okay? So look at your acquisitions policy, which you should all have. Is it fit for purpose? Does it accurately reflect your museum and your mission and the stories you want to tell in the future? Perhaps it does, but then look at your procedures. Are you sticking to your acquisitions policy? How are objects coming into your museum? What's your approvals process like? Are the people involved in acquisition decisions also the same people who are having to deal with the stores and the rationalisation program? What's happening at your front desk? What's happening when members of the public turn up with carrier bags full of objects they would like to donate to the museum? that, as we all know, sometimes are fantastic new acquisitions, sometimes they're just not right for your museum. What's happening with those objects? Are they remaining in the museum? Are you having to deal with them? I really recommend getting control of the conveyor belt of objects coming in before you even approach disposal. Otherwise, you'll always be catching your tail. Every museum is different, and I don't want to sort of sit here and say this is the right this worked for us, so it will definitely work for you. You've got to figure out the best way to do this yourself, okay? But for us at NMS, a couple of things we have done that have helped. I will just let you know. So we now have a collections committee, which just provides a bit of scrutiny for any new acquisitions that come into the collection. So you have a committee to decide whether or not something can leave the collection. Why not have one to decide whether or not something can come into the collection? And we just ask some of the difficult questions around things like storage and documentation and conservation. The other thing we do as well, we were starting to roll out across our museums, is a blanket policy on not accepting any unsolicited donations at the front desk. So we've armed our VS teams with a very useful leaflet which explains what the museum does and does not collect, and also explains the process by which a member of the public can approach the museum to offer objects for donation. But the basic principle is nothing left at the front desk without prior appointment. And those things have really worked for us. So, but as I say, the basic principle is, I think you've got to look at it as a sort of as a whole. Think about what's coming into the museum as well as what potentially needs to leave the museum. And once you've got control of both, you can finally start getting control of your collections. Okay, so number 2, and that is that disposal is all about increasing access to collections. And you may get some slightly quizzical looks if you say that to anybody, along the lines of how can you possibly increase access to collections you're planning to get rid of. My argument would be to think big. Think bigger than just your museum. Think of every single museum in the country as one huge collective entity, and think of their combined collections as the national collection. So then, for me, rationalisation is simply all of the nation's museums having a bit of a sort out, and basically moving their collections around until they sort of fit into the most appropriate home possible. Because, and that's to say, rationalisation is it's a process. It's an ongoing process. So it's not something you're going to do. You're not going to complete rationalisation. There's no end point. You need to. It's something that will continue needing to be done, which is why every museum should be doing it. And it's also why those objects you are going to select for disposal, they're underused objects. They're probably not going to feature in your next exhibition. They're probably not going to be in your brand new redisplay. The consequences of you doing nothing are probably that they'll sit in a box in your store for the next 30 years, taking up space. But they might be valued somewhere and by somebody else. And that's why rationalisation is all about, for me, increasing access to collections. I've got one quick story which helps to illustrate this point. And it's from when I first started working in museums, and I was working with a very experienced curator who had been with the museum service for several decades. And we were looking at a collection of dentist equipment. And when I say dentist equipment, I mean a dentist chair, drill, the cabinet. I mean, you could fit out an entire dentist room from the 1940s with this stuff. And he was shaking his head looking at it and said, I was a very young curator a couple of decades ago when I acquired this, and I knew almost instantly that I'd made a mistake. And do you know what? He had made a mistake, because nearly 30 years on, those objects had never been used for anything at all. They just simply sat in store, taking up loads of space. We rationalised them and rehomed them with a local independent museum in Norfolk, and they're on permanent display. So for 30 years of sitting in a store, being seen by nobody, they're now on permanent display and seen by everybody who visits the museum who acquired them. So that's why, for me, it's about increasing access. You can also obviously, if you get your stores fit for purpose, like the one you can see behind me, you can do cool things like behind the scenes tours and invite the public into your stored spaces, and again, increasing access. So that's my number two. The third is about talking to your stakeholders. Okay, so you should probably be prepared for the possibility that at some point somebody's going to question what you're doing. You may even get somebody approaching you really alarmed and saying things like, oh, I've heard you're going to throw all of your collections into the skip. Don't worry, I'll bring my van round, I'll take everything. Don't throw anything out, don't throw anything out, or something mad like that. For this, what I would just say is, before you even start, make sure you've got all of your arguments for why it's a good thing, okay, clear in your head. So you can say to anybody who questions what you're doing, you know, that it's about access, it's about increasing access to collection, exactly what I was just talking about. You can say it's about making sure that we can sort out our stores and have some space in our stores and more effective storage. You can say that it's about ensuring the museum is able to continue acquiring collections into the future, and to collect a more diverse and representative collection. There's all sorts of reasons you can bring out to justify what you're doing, and there'll obviously be some that are specific to your museum as well. The other thing I would do is to know where the sector guidelines are and those sorts of information, and know where you can signpost people to have a look into, and so that they can see for themselves that not only are we allowed to do this, we are actually actively being encouraged to do this as part of excellent collections management. Then I would talk to your stakeholders in advance. So you're going to have to talk to your trustees or your councillors or whoever has legal ownership of the collections as part of your approvals process in any case. So my suggestion would be not to rock up at a trustee meeting with a list of objects you want to dispose of, but perhaps have that conversation beforehand. I would also recommend having conversation with your staff and volunteers, particularly those that aren't directly involved with the collections work. I think often it's staff and volunteers who are most invested in the museum and its collections, and they're possibly the ones who are most likely to take alarm. And actually, what I'd love to see more museums do is talk to your visitors, talk to your communities and our audiences about what you're planning to do and get their input. I do slightly tire of this idea that those of us working with rationalisation need to sort of somehow be skulking around in the shadows as if we're doing something really terrible, when we're not actually. What we're actually doing is excellent collections management work that is required for the long-term care of the collections, and I don't think we should apologise about it. And I do think any discussions around disposal do require very careful communication, very careful and considered thought as to how you communicate what we're doing and why it's being done. I'm not saying you should just rush in gung-ho, but I do think we should talk to our visitors more about rationalisation. And after all, whose collections are they really anyway? Who really owns the collections? They belong to the community, don't they? So we should be talking to them about the decisions we're going to make about their collections. Yeah, and the final thing I would say on this is I keep a file of good news stories, basically. So for instance, the dentist's collection I mentioned, I've got some lovely photographs of them on display at their new museum, and I've got a whole folder full of basically good news stories. So if ever I need to demonstrate sort of very visually and clearly the benefit of going through rationalisation with collections. I've got loads and loads of examples of all the great things we've done with collections that are no longer may no longer be part of the Norfolk Museum Service collection, but they're doing wonderful things elsewhere. Okay, on to number 4. So the disposal toolkit, pros and cons of the disposal toolkit. So it is the most important document that you have, and I like it in the sense that it very clearly and very concisely sets out the how to dispose of a museum object from start to finish. It's full of answers, full of information. Definitely the most important document to look at, and definitely the first place to go to when you have a question. Okay. However, my one issue with the document is that they haven't applied a scale. So the advice is the same whether you're the British Museum or you're a small volunteer-run museum. Okay, and there's no advice or information in there about how to adjust what you do a scale, basically. One of my colleagues once said to me, and I think this is probably true, the document is written as if you're a national museum rationalising one oil painting, okay, rather than perhaps a small museum with very limited resources needing to rationalise a large social history collection. Okay, the problem with this is I do fear that if you look at the amount of information in there and some of the hoops you need to jump through, that it may lead to inertia and a lack of progress or no progress. So I think the sensible thing to do, as they haven't applied a scale themselves, is to apply your own scale. Okay, so it's just about certainly read through the whole document, digest the information, okay, and where there are legal requirements, clearly you need to stick to those. Beyond that, I think what you need to do is you need to stick to the spirit of the guidelines, but there are places where you can probably scale down based upon the resources that you have available to you. Okay, so one of the clear examples of this, and this is often one of the most resource heavy bits of disposal, is when it comes to trying to rehome objects and the amount of effort you put into finding the best new home for collections. It's possible that's the sort of thing you could scale down a little bit if you don't have the resources of, say, Norfolk Museum Service or the British Museum or whoever. Yeah. So number 5 is about collections review, and it's just to say, I would just recommend, ideally, if you have the time to do it like this, build in some extra documentation and collections care work as part of the review process, because you're going to be opening lots of lids of lots of boxes. You're going to be picking up lots of your collections and looking at them. You're going to be checking lots of records to make your assessment for recommendations for disposal. If you go into this much trouble, it's quite an efficient way to work if you also say, well, let's check the object locations of the collections in this box. Are they all right? Has everything got a record? Is all the information input? If you want to be really fancy, you could take some photographs. You're handling the object, so perhaps you can have a look and say, well, does this object need to be cleaned? Oh, what are these small holes? Perhaps that's got woodworm. Does it need to be frozen? Could we repack this box in a better way than it's currently packed? Those sorts of things, which I do appreciate. If you do all of that, it's going to be even more time consuming and it's going to slow you down. And I get that might not be possible. But if it is possible, and given that they're all good things to do, I would just build it into one big process where making a rationalisation decision is part of the process, but you can do all of those other wonderful things at the same time. Okay, number 6. So when you get to the stage that you need to start making some decisions, my advice is that you need to be radical and conservative at the same time, which I know is a contradiction and sounds a bit of a daft thing to say, but I think those of us that work in museums, we are natural collectors, conservers, protectors, and safeguarders of things. It goes against the grain a little bit for us to dispose. I think we need to be radical when we make some of our decisions, and we kind of sometimes need to go against our gut and just to really focus on and remember all of those benefits we talked about at the beginning of and just to remember why rationalisation is so beneficial and so important. And because I've sat in meetings where decisions are being made on an object by object basis about which we should dispose and which we should keep, and I've been frustrated in the past by just how cautious some colleagues have been. And I think sometimes you need to take a slightly bolder approach. And I think it's not without risk. It would be foolish to pretend disposing of collections is risk-free. There are risks, you could make mistakes, but I do think it requires radical thinking and bold thinking to get the collections that aren't appropriate for your museum out the door to somewhere where perhaps they are. That said, those colleagues who are cautious, they're not cautious for no good reason. Okay, it is because it's important, and therefore it's important to be conservative too. And trust me, if you do enough of this, you'll get a sixth sense for when you can be a little bit bolder and when you need to be a little bit more careful. Okay, but if you're not sure, one of the things we've done in the past, which I think is quite a useful sort of tip, is it's not all or nothing. You could attach conditions to approving disposal of an object. Okay, you can impose conditions on yourself. So if you look at an object and you think it's not right for our museum, perhaps, but this is a really, really important thing. We really have a duty of care for this object. It's important. What are we going to do? You could in that instance impose a condition that says we will only rehome this museum with another accredited museum. If we fail to find an accredited museum to take this object, we will retain it in our collection and provide the care it obviously requires. We've done that quite a few times in the past, including several occasions with objects that we simply couldn't rehome, and we have therefore, even though they're perhaps not appropriate for our collection necessarily, we've decided that they're important nonetheless, and we're going to retain them. So it's not all or nothing, but yeah, be bold, be radical, but also be careful. So wow, we're on to number 7. I said at the beginning that we've rehomed 670 objects, about a third of those to other accredited museums, which means there's a significant volume there that we've rehomed elsewhere. And yeah, once you get to this stage, once you've satisfied yourself that you're not going to rehome with another accredited museum, you're one step away from the object leaving the public domain. So I think you can get a bit creative here, and this is where you really can be a bit bolder, and just think outside the box. So to give you some examples of places we've sent our objects, so we've had objects go into sort of reminiscence kits for nursing homes. We've had objects rehomed as handling collections for learning teams, but also to go into schools themselves. We had a school that wanted to open their own museum in their school, so we donated them a piano and a couple of other objects. We've had objects go to artists, including an artist who destroyed some of our collections in the name of art, but she drew them first, and the drawings actually became accessioned into the collection. We've had theatre groups use our rationalised collections. I rehomed some beer bottles with a local pub, and perhaps my favourite, we had a film prop company acquire some 1940s wheelchairs and a stretcher, and they hire objects out to theatre groups, for film and for TV, and for things like that. So you think about it. one of our wheelchairs ends up in the next sort of big BBC drama, and you talk about public access, there's quite a few millions of people going to see that. Yeah, just think creatively, really, once you get to that stage. Okay, so number 8 is the importance of documentation. So I know for some of you, documentation is a bit of a chore. I mean, not me, I love it, but I know for some people, documentation isn't exactly your idea of having a good time. But it is really, really important. And in this context, it's absolutely fundamental, because these objects are leaving your collection. So you've got to record what happened to them. And yeah, you're all going to have your own different documentation systems and ways of recording information. The most important takeaway point here is to look at the spectrum standard on the accessioning and disposal. That will tell you the information that is important you record, and then you can develop your own using your own systems to best do that. But check at the spectrum standard, because the consequences of not doing this properly are that either yourselves or your colleagues in the future will be in a position where they spend an entire afternoon looking around a store for an object that is no longer in your collection. I am certain at various stages I have spent hours doing things like that, because probably decades ago something left our collection, there was no good documentation, and I'm looking for a phantom object. Your other potential issue as well, of course, is somebody donates something to your museum 30 years ago, and perhaps their children or their grandchildren get in touch to see if they can have a look at the object. You haven't done your documentation properly, you didn't record it leaving the museum. Again, you've spent all afternoon looking for it, couldn't find it, a bit annoyed because you wasted your whole afternoon. Now you've got to go and talk to somebody, a member of the public, and tell them that you've lost or you can't find the object they donated, which is really embarrassing. Whereas 5-10 minutes simple documentation, and you could tell them straight away, oh, okay, that's fine, no, we've rehomed that with the museum down the road. If you go and contact them, I'm sure they'll be able to let you see it. Okay, so documentation, as ever, very, very important. And then on to number 9, just to say, rationalization is not a quick fix. Okay, you're not going to it's not going to be a speedy process. Okay, by its nature, it's time consuming. You need to have a plan in place. You need to be able to review your collections. You need to put them through an approvals process. The museum's journal listings, they need to be in there for 2 months, and then you've got to try and find somebody to take them off your hands. You've got to rehome them. And then even when you have rehomed them, you'll end up with a lawnmower in your store 6 years after the museum said that they would take it, because they have no way of coming to collect it. They have limited resources. And I've got loads of objects like that museums have said they will have, but I'm still waiting for them to come and collect. So it's not a quick fix, but don't let that put you off doing it. But just be realistic about how quickly you're going to have empty shelves in your store. Yeah, and also if you are a slightly bigger museum, if you if you are able to help, because with rehoming collections in the sector, generally it's a receiving museum that would pay for the transportation or delivery costs. Often that's the stumbling block, because they're such small museums, they don't have the budgets to acquire for the transportation and things like that. So we have in the past helped out a little bit with that, particularly when we want to get the objects out the door more quickly, but we have helped in the past with things like that. So if you are from a slightly bigger museum and you do have a bit of a spare budget well, none of us have spare budgets, but if you're able to help at all, I think that's quite a useful thing to do. Just in terms of, in the spirit of not being put off, remember what I said earlier, that disposal is a process, it's not a job that you're going to finish. So if you don't have money, resources, and you don't have much time to put into this, just break it down into really, really small chunks. maybe even just do a few boxes at a time, okay, and just keep continually making progress with it. Small amounts of progress, you know, it's better than doing nothing. And then finally, number 10 is about a bold new approach. So I feel like the ground's beginning to shift a little bit. I feel like there's growing support in the sector for us being able to take a slightly bolder approach with rationalisation. So really my tip here is to just watch this space and keep your eyes open and check out developments in the sector. It's interesting to read the Empowering Collections report that's fairly recent still, which does talk about rationalisation and the problems that it causes museums. And the key recommendations from that report were for more available training for staff and volunteers, which would be fantastic. But they also recommend, and I quote, funders should also support innovative rationalisation projects that include public input. So some of those problems around resource and around capacity, hopefully there will be some more funding streams or funding options or sympathetic funders, funders sympathetic to rationalisation projects coming online in the not too distant future. So yeah, tip 10, watch this space. So they're my top 10 rationalisation tips. I hope I hope some of those were at least a little bit useful. I am happy to, if anybody has any questions about any of my my top 10 tips, or if anybody would just like to ask me anything about disposal of museum collections generally, I'm very happy for people to contact me. And probably the easiest way is my email address, which is wayne.kett, and that's Kett @ norfolk.gov.uk. Thank you very much.